All right, good day to everybody. Welcome to the Videocast podcast, Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, pastor professor. I'm the self-appointed Anselm Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture at Faith Seeking Understanding University, where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things for free. So we're glad that you're here, and I'm also glad to be in conversation again with my friend Michael Cruz. Good day to you, Michael.
Good day. Nice to see you again.
You too. And I'm, by the way, I'm in Ashland, Ohio, and we just got through a really, really bad storm. So I was hoping the power wouldn't go out. Yes. Yeah. But you are in Kansas City, Kansas or Missouri?
Missouri.
Okay. I wanted to ask because I figured if I got it wrong, that could be an insult.
It could be, but I'm 4/10 of a mile on the Missouri side. So
okay, so
I'll have them both. So
you are a Missourian. All right. Anyway, okay. And Kansas City is a really nice place. I've been there and loved it. This is our second video podcast in our new series called Calmly Considered, where we calmly consider issues of economics, culture, scripture, Christianity. And today, our program is entitled Capitalism versus Socialism, Getting Beyond the Memes. And of course, Michael, I know you like I have seen a lot of Facebook memes that roundly reject in toto, in a few words, either socialism or capitalism.
Right, exactly.
We want to get beyond that, and we want to talk about that. And I'm going to, for this, I am going to sort of catapult the conversation based on 3 articles that you recommended that I read, and I read them. And I will these will be in the description on both the podcast and videocast, the links. So anyone wanting to read these very good articles, they're not long articles,
right,
on capitalism and socialism, to get a better understanding of it, you are welcome to take a look at those articles. They will be posted in the descriptions. So the subtitle of Michael, of the one you recommended to me, The Catalyst, and this is from the George W. Bush Institute.
Right.
As I see, and the subtitle is Capitalism versus Socialism is the Wrong Way to Frame Today's Economic Debate.
Right.
Now, why is it the wrong way to frame the debate?
If you look at economics, you're talking about how you going to a taxonomy for how you're going to talk about economic systems and how they work. Okay. And capitalism and capitalism and socialism are essentially 2 ideal types, as they talk about in sociology and other social sciences. They are neat ideas that cohere together, but neither exist in reality in the true sense of what the word is. And so if you want to place it on a continuum, at one end is the idea of capitalism, where there should be private property and everything gets decided by market decisions, by prices that occur from the dynamic of exchange between supply and demand. And then on the socialist side is the idea that all means of production should be owned by the state and that the state should determine how things are going to be distributed. Well, there is no place where either one of those exists. And so what we're talking about is gradations in the middle that are based on any number of different issues, some of them moral, some of them purely based on cognitive limitations of human beings. They have to be certain ways because human beings don't have certain capabilities. And various gradations in between those 2 extremes. And if you look at most economists, the difference is the degree to which they think markets function pretty well, to which the degree they don't think they operate very well at all. But they almost all agree that some level of market activity occurs, but they may disagree to some degree about how well they occur, and so what the role of the state needs to be in that. So talking about I'm a socialist or I'm a capitalist really doesn't tell you a whole lot. You need to be talking about what are the specific issues or concerns that you have in the economy and reflecting on those.
So let me get this next question then out of the way, because when you say there's no pure socialist system, I can tell you right now, there are some people going to say Cuba,
Yeah.
but that really doesn't fit, does it?
No, it doesn't. There's still
Go
people
ahead.
still have private property. I mean,
Yeah.
they have individual private property. It is true that Cuba is probably one of the most fully, I'm going to say totalitarian, but it is fully controlled by the state. That certainly is true. And so therefore, all of the problems that adhere from that happen in Cuba. You get that as well too, but it is not fully a socialist or communist state.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in one of these articles, somebody makes the distinction between socialism and communism,
Right.
and says that while communism always involves some kind of large degree of socialism, communism and socialism are not the same.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, and again, however I put this, you'll find another expert who's going to tweak whatever I say, and I probably want to tweak what they say. So there's no precise definition, but
Absolutely.
I think in general terms, when I think of communism, you think of Marx, and you think of the idea that the eventual end game is where there is no private property, where everything's held in common and everything is shared, and actually even the state disappears. That you have that order, and that is the natural working out of the world. That's where things are going to end up, according to Marx. And he would say that socialism is sort of the last step before you get to that perfect world where everything's owned by everyone. And so the state has to take control over the economy to own things, to run it, and then eventually private property disappears.
Right.
Now there are, I think the other thing in terms of socialism versus communism is often viewed in the sort of the Marxist-Leninist terms, that there should be a revolution, that we need to accomplish the objectives here and now, and so it is often very violent and revolutionary. Where many socialist streams are more about the democratic incremental movement away from capitalism towards instituting a socialist world, that's the more practical way of doing it. There's no hurry to get there. This is where things ultimately evolve. So we're just going to keep nudging things along that process to get there. But I think a third distinction, though, that I think is important, we're talking about communism, and then you talk about socialism, which still shares that view to some degree, that the idea that the economy should be controlled by society and there shouldn't be much private ownership. There's also another one that's often confused or called socialism, which is social democracies, which would be countries like Denmark and Norway and Sweden, some of these countries, and the Nordic countries. And they embrace the idea of markets and business and free trade and all those type of things. But they believe that their societies are more productive when people are well provided for and taken care of. And so the state takes on a bigger role in terms of promoting the welfare of people, because that makes them more productive in their capitalist economy. And that sometimes gets characterized as socialism as well, which I think is a misnomer. And if you talk with people from those countries who know economics, they will disavow that they are socialist. But then as you move away from that, there are also varying degrees of capitalism as to how well they would meet that ideal type I described as capitalism.
Yeah, so it really is a mistake to sort of equate Cuba in with those social democracies.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so sometimes we all do it from time to time, is we, whatever it is we oppose, we take the worst form of it and hold that up as the example. But if you're going to really critique socialism in any degree, you're going to have to look at the places where, like Denmark and others, where there's more, what we would call more socialism, certainly, than in the United States, but still, it's a market economy.
Yep, absolutely.
And it's free. So I had to, one of the things that made me chuckle was this one article where the quote is, I want to read this to you. It said, even Bernie Sanders, the candidate most associated with the term democratic socialist, and who was saying we should be more like Denmark, was publicly asked by Denmark's prime minister to stop saying that because it was damaging their brand.
Exactly.
So even Denmark, they don't want to be viewed as socialist. They've got some socialist aspects.
Right. And all of that goes back to their history, their culture, in terms of communal farms that they had before
Yeah.
capitalism ever emerged, and how that sort of fed into how their society works. It's a very different culture in many respects to what we have in the United States and other parts of Western Europe. So it sort of feeds there. So I'm not sure, and I think that's the other part of it too, is to capitalism to some degree, or any economic system, is going to reflect nuances of the particular culture where it happens. And so American capitalism is not Japanese capitalism, is not Brazilian capitalism, is not, you know, there are similarities, there are general themes that are similar, but how each culture and society works that out is a little bit different. So,
Yeah. One of the things that one of the articles was pointing out that I thought was fascinating, it's nothing that never occurred to me, was the point was that in countries like Europe, and you talk about being a different culture,
right,
is that while you have a let's say a more generous social safety net for
right,
citizens. Let's again go back to Denmark. But one of the things they seem to say that also there's also more of a perspective in those countries of taking less risks economically, reaching out and traveling somewhere to start a new business. So GDP tends to probably be slower
right,
GDP, in that country. In the United States, we've had less of a social safety net, but in our culture, it's the culture of taking risks, of getting out and starting your own business, or even if you've got to go somewhere, right? Even if you got to travel out of state, you're gonna have your slice of the American pie, right? And so we've had less social safety net. This one economist was concerned because he says, at least his analysis is, that right now Americans are starting to resemble more Europeans and not taking risks, that we want more security. He says the problem with that is going to be is if you don't increase the strength of the public safety net,
right,
it's not going to be a good recipe. That to have a smaller, a less robust social safety net, you've got to have a lot of people stepping out and taking risks for the economy.
right.
What's your thoughts on that?
Wow, that's a complicated one, and I think there are legitimate arguments to be made in multiple directions. I know that one of the things in the American economy, and entrepreneurship has slowed considerably in the past 20, 25, 30 years, somewhere around there. The number of people that start businesses, whether that's related to, quote, socialist policies or people wanting socialist policies, I think that's an unknown at this point as to what's there. At least that's my perspective. I don't know that I would solidly attribute it to that. I do know that there are things, for instance, like mobility, people being willing to move to get jobs. Part of a capitalist system is based on the idea that there will be creative destruction. As one industry develops and develops new techniques, it's going to take down other industries in its wake, and those jobs will be lost. But the idea is that the new industries are also creating new jobs and new types of jobs, but they may not necessarily be in the places where the previous workers live, which means you have to be able to pick up and move to go to where the jobs are. And one of the thorns in that sort of capitalist model of thinking that it's a dynamic economy and let's have creative destruction and let things keep developing is that people tend to be embedded in communities.
Yeah.
And when they have sometimes generations of roots in a particular place, and when those jobs leave there, it is incredibly daunting and scary to move halfway across the country where you have no support network, you have no financial network to support you in being able to go make that move. And I think that that's one thing that has been underestimated by those who promote sort of just the rapid, change in the economy, is not recognizing the sociological side of that equation as well. And so a stronger safety net for a person who's willing to pick up and go to get another job, knowing that their health care is not connected with their employment, to be able to have incentives that will make them feel more safe, when they travel elsewhere. There's another theory that says too, this sort of competing with the one that you gave a second ago, is that people are more likely to be entrepreneurial when they feel like there is less risk to being entrepreneurial. If I have to go out to, if I want to start a company, but that means losing my job and losing my health care in order to go start this company, I'm less likely to do that because that's a pretty big risk. If it means taking my job, but I've still got my healthcare coverage intact, and I've got the basic things I need to support me as I try to go get this job, if that fails, I can still come back, get another employment. So in other words, it lowers the risks, it lowers the barrier to pursue entrepreneurship if you have those basic support networks in place. That's one theory about it. And I hear the other theory too, that if you make things too safe, too comfortable, then that may also discourage entrepreneurship by some people, because why do something dynamic? I really think the thing that may challenge entrepreneurship in places like Europe and France, some of the places you have very strong, I'll be careful how I say this. There are very strong labor agreements where it's very difficult to fire people for whatever reason. And so if once you get a business and you get somebody hired, it's very difficult to change your business models, to fire certain employees, hire other employees to do certain things. I think some of the regulatory aspects that exist that really have nothing to do with the social safety net probably have a bigger impact on entrepreneurship than safety net. That's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
So often what I'm hearing from you is really what this whole conversation we're having is based around, is that so much of this stuff is not either or. Right. It's not either socialism or capitalism, that there's all kinds of complicated things going on. And it's not just you go wherever the money is or wherever the jobs are. I mean, I knew a guy in another place where I was living 20 years ago who had his own little business, and he had a job. He and his wife were working. They were not making a ton of money, but they were okay.
Right.
And I can remember having a conversation with him one time when he said, I know I could go to a larger town and make more money. He says, but I like where we are.
Yeah.
And I'm comfortable,
Yeah.
He knew he wasn't bringing in the kingdom as far as income, but hey, he was okay with that,
Exactly.
And so there are other factors than just what goes into the wallet. Isn't that the case?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is intriguing. So we've been kind of saying when it comes to socialism, it's not all that simple. Let's talk a little bit about capitalism, because we haven't seen it much of late. But you notice that it depends on whoever is president. You get these memes on social media. So when Donald Trump was president, and I remember seeing it when George W. Bush was president, you get these memes against capitalism.
Sure.
That it creates it impersonalizes the worker, or it commodifies everything, or it's just capitalism cannot function apart from greed and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Those are simplistic memes too, aren't they?
Sure. Yeah. And the rhetorical strategy that happens from both sides on this issue when they're trying to champion one versus the other is to compare, well, in your case that you're just mentioning there, real world capitalism with ideal socialism. Right? Or in the reverse, to compare real world socialism with ideal capitalism. And the issue is comparing real world capitalism with real world socialism, or if you want to have the philosophical debate, ideal capitalism versus ideal socialism. So it's real easy for me to be able to point out the human frailties and fallibilities that turn up in either an economic or socialist system, and then just simply ignore that those are going to exist in my alternative that's going to be there. And I'm always going to look better with my model. Right. So the question is how do the two compare in the real world?
Yeah, we critique the real with the ideal. That's a real good point. And of course, the ideal doesn't exist either, but we use it because we use it because we think it makes our argument, it makes our case.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And every economic system, regardless of where it falls on the scale, is subject to abuse, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. There is no abuse-free form of economics.
Yeah, that's right. Would it be nice? You know, I
Yeah.
remember years ago reading Adam Smith, you know, The Wealth of Nations, the father of capitalism. And as I say, that I have read both Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Karl Marx Capital
Wow.
reveals I have no life.
Like punishment, don't you?
I mean, just to show you, when I was in college that I was home on the weekends, right? But it's been many, many years. But I remember Adam Smith saying in his discussion of free markets and his discussion of capital, he said, those who raise the capital, those who you know, create the jobs. He's talking about those business owners and
Right.
entrepreneurs. Those who create the jobs, those who generate the wealth, have a moral obligation
Right.
to take care of the workers who make it possible for that wealth to be generated. In other words,
Exactly.
Smith doesn't think that this is a zero-sum game of what is my profit at the end of the month.
Right.
He is not promoting Ebenezer Scrooge model, right?
Right. Exactly. Right.
He thinks that in order for a nation, a community to flourish economically, that this needs to be something everybody gets to participate in. So he thinks those who generate the wealth have a moral obligation to make sure that those who work, I don't know if you want to use the term paid a living wage or pay or what, but they need to have a stake in the system.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And he was the one also, I can't remember the exact quote, but he says no sooner than the business people of the community get together, they begin to conspire as to how to cheat the public out of their money. And so he didn't have this idea that somehow just creating a free market with business people trading was going to lead to some great utopia where everybody behaved well. That was his reason for not having the government concentrated in terms of giving what do you say, monopolies and that type of thing to various businesses, because that's exactly what the businesses would try to get in order to try to steal profits from folks. Yeah. So he was exactly. And the idea, I think that feeds into the whole American experiment at the beginning, was the idea you wanted to have a free society, but assumed in that free society was also virtue, that the other institutions in society would be building and promoting virtue, whether it's the church or the educational institutions or the various voluntary associations that people make, that those would also be building virtue, and that those values then become reflected in the economic decisions that people make. And that's how you get the economy to operate in a more just way. It wasn't about freedom for people to do whatever they darn well pleased.
Yeah, I like to point out to certain friends of mine that when Thomas Jefferson wrote The Pursuit of Happiness in the Declaration of Independence, he was not referring to me pursuing my own selfish interest, but he had the Greek concept of eudaimonia in mind, which is really amounts to community flourishing, that we all have the right to pursue happiness together. But that also means a social contract, obligations we have to each other. Right. And it's not just about me being able to do what I want, which I'd like to think, I'm not a big fan of Christendom, but I do like to think that notion of community flourishing and virtue that you mentioned is really rooted in Scripture. Right. That we all have a community obligation, which is interesting, you know, in the midst of COVID and masks and vaccines and all of that to talk about, but we won't get off on that topic right now. So let me ask you this question. So where do you think, I remember many years ago listening to an interview by Bill Bennett. A long time ago. I think he's still around, but he said he said one time something I thought was interesting, and he said, you know, we need to think about what it is that the private sector does well, and let the private sector do that. We also, he said, need to think about what the government does well, and let the government do that. Now, of course, there's going to be debates about who does what well. Right. Where is, you know, so we've got a market economy here in the United States. Is there any place where, is there a place for the government? Where do you think the government needs to regulate a little more, or at least?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a really complicated question.
And that's really complicated. I get that. I understand. I mean, I know I asked you these huge questions, but
Right.
what
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to do is kind of drill down
Yeah.
in this either or stuff and to say, all right,
Right.
Michael, give me an example where you think the government would do a good job of assisting the private sector in not being able to go after its worst instincts.
You're right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's look at one example that already exists that sort of serendipitously developed over American history, and that's the idea of mandatory public education. All right. So that's something that the government requires. It's something that the government help funds and support, make sure it's happened, that type of thing. So why do that? Is that socialism? To be requiring that? There are certain activities. Well, let's just take that. If I am 16, 17 years old, and I go to get a high school education, and through my education that I've been getting up through those years, I learned to read, I learned to write, I can do math at a high functional level, those types of things. That's going to benefit me personally in terms of my interactions in the economy. So I will benefit from that. But in a free society, shouldn't I also be able to choose not to do that, to not learn how to read and write and not do those? And I'll suffer the consequences, but those will be my consequences if I choose not to do that.
Yeah.
What we learn is that when everybody is able to read, write, and do math at a functional level, it enables everybody to interact with each other at such a high level that it stimulates the productivity and the effectiveness of the economy and our other social institutions. So the benefit of the exchange of me spending my time and getting the education doesn't just benefit the educator and me, but ends up having spillovers that benefit all my neighbors and the rest of society as well. So it has very high positive externalities in terms of that contract. So therefore, as a society, we've decided it's important to have public education because that makes us a better functioning democracy and a better functioning society. So that's one area where I would say in the past, we sort of came to that conclusion about that. I would say another one immediately on the horizon that needs to be resolved in a similar direction is healthcare. That healthcare should be available. If you have everybody able to get the basic preventative tests and so on to maintain their health, to have basic levels of healthcare, you're going to have a more productive, stable society. And as I was suggesting, possibly you could even increase things like entrepreneurship. It could increase other more risk-taking decisions that people might make because they aren't so fearful about what's going to happen with their health and how that's going to play out. And let me qualify that to say that doesn't necessarily mean I'm advocating socialized medicine in sort of the British model. And I don't want to get into somebody with Britain or whoever who's the best and so on and so forth. I think there are other models that exist. For instance, in Germany, if my understanding is that the government mandates that everybody has to have health insurance. And there's 150 different insurance agencies through which you can get the health insurance. And those all have to have a certain minimal level of coverage in terms of what they cover. And the government then subsidizes citizens to be able to go buy the health insurance that they choose to buy, but they subsidize them in buying that. And something like the bottom half of the population pays nothing for health insurance because the government subsidizes them to that. As you get beyond that, the wealthier you get, the bigger portion you're paying of that healthcare subsidy. So everybody has universal healthcare. It's universal healthcare. Everybody has that basic level of healthcare, but it is not socialized medicine. And there are other models elsewhere that are different. So I'm not advocating for a specific model of some kind, but just the idea if you had universal coverage that wasn't linked to employment, that's the type of thing that would have these positive externalities that would, I think, help society flourish.
Yeah, I think I was reading 3 or 4 weeks ago an article in Forbes. 40% of all cancer patients in America lose their life savings.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, well, I'm no expert on the solution, but I know that's a problem.
Yeah.
and we need to do something about that. The other thing that you just said that reveals again to me that when it comes to healthcare, again, we make this simplistic. It's either some kind of laissez-faire system or it's single payer. It's what they have in
Right.
Britain, in Canada. And there are not, and you know, there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are several different healthcare models in Europe
Sure,
that
sure.
France, I think, doesn't have single payer, but they're, if I'm correct, but
Right.
their model covers almost everybody.
Right. It's been a
So
while since
again,
I've-
how can we have this conversation to move toward a solution, though, when you've got politicians in Washington whose number one concern is reelection,
Right.
who really aren't interested in getting anything done, but just hanging on to their job and the perks, who
Right.
know that if they're going to be reelected, the one thing they must do is gin up their base
Yep.
with simplistic, extreme arguments.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that's the challenge for people who are thought leaders, for people who are in front of communities who are talking, is to be more reflective on the language that they're using and how they go about presenting some of these topics. Politicians, we know what we're going to get from politicians. That's expected. They aren't there to try to educate us and bring us to the truth. They're there to get elected and to hold power. But that's not the case of thought leaders and people who have audiences to whom they are trying to nurture towards greater virtue. The thing that one of the things you brought up there I was going to comment on is that we've heard this going back a century or more. Anytime you try to introduce some reform, like I was talking about with the healthcare, there's immediately a faction of the right wing of the country that comes out and calls that socialism. And boy, you're hearing that in spades right now from all the Republicans. Biden's ultra socialist agenda to do this, that, yeah. Okay, so socialism, communism, it's the big scary words. Harry Truman, does his deal, and all of his proposals are socialism, that type of thing. So they aren't socialism. They're progressive, policies that are run-of-the-mill progressive policies that exist in a variety of capital systems all around the world. So it's not socialism per se. And so what a lot of people that are saying they're socialist are saying is they want more of those progressive policies. That's the direction in which they want to move. And they feel that those would be more just and it'd be better for society. And on some issues, I'm probably in agreement with them that that's where they are. That doesn't mean that they are socialists. And yet they run around saying that they're socialists, that they buy into socialism and that they are socialists. And so what I see, it's given me whiplash when I follow some of these memes on some people's sites. On the one hand, you get one post showing Harry Truman and all the stuff that he's proposing, and they're saying, see, all these people called it socialism, see how much they lied, from a guy who in the next post says, do you like the library? Do you like the post office? Do you like the park department? Then you like socialism, and I'm a socialist. And it's just like, the word has no meaning other than to be as a dig, either capitalism or socialism, to be a dig to both fire up the people that are in agreement with you and to antagonize the people that disagree with you. And that's
I dare say, go ahead. I dare say that, and again, I want to be careful, but I think a lot of people who, again, just pick up these words. And, I need to say a word of wisdom here. I think it's a word of wisdom, is that all of us need to listen to the politicians we like a lot less, right? We don't listen to the ones we don't like. So I don't have to tell you not to listen to them, but the ones we like, listen to them less, because their job is not to enlighten you. Their job is to make you angry, so you'll vote for them for their reelection, right? And one of the things that let's get into, there's two other subjects I want to get into before our time is up. One is these articles pointed out, one of them pointed out very nicely that when young people, for example, the polls that have been done of late, young people, they say favor socialism.
Right.
And of course, the article points out they really don't know what socialism is.
Exactly. Of course.
But the point is that what they're doing is naming a dissatisfaction with the current system.
Absolutely.
That they really don't want socialism, but they think they want it, but it's dissatisfaction with the fact that there are people over the last 50 years and less who have, for various reasons that are probably rather complex too, have not progressed with the economy.
Yeah, right.
And they're dissatisfied with that. And who wouldn't be, right?
Right. Yeah.
So what is it? So they're saying we favor socialism. No, that's not what they favor. What is it they're really looking for when they say that?
I think that they think that there is, but again, I'm trying to articulate what somebody else is saying, what's in their heads. But what I tend to hear is that the capitalist system that we have in the United States has become too dominated by the economic players, that they're the ones who are causing all the shots, and that there isn't enough attention given to making sure that the benefits of having that capitalist society are being shared by a broad enough number of people. And that there's a lot of rigging of the system that happens with people who have money and are in that economic system. And there's truth to that. There's absolutely truth to that. And it's something I agree with. The question often then is, then what's the remedy? And that's where the challenge, I think, often comes in with some of this. And I love what you said about listening to the politicians you agree with less, because what the politicians will tell you almost always is to put more political power in my side of the equation is the answer. When some of these cases, I don't mean everything, but in some of these cases, the issue is to depoliticize.
Yeah, exactly right. Now make it political.
Yeah.
I sometimes wondered if we have framed economic and moral problems in the culture, that they're framed in a way as not to be solved, so that we can continue this argument for the purpose of trying to get our politicians reelected who we think will take care of the job, but who really don't. Because these politicians, they're not, and again, I'm not saying they're all insincere. I'm sure there are people in Congress that really do want to solve these things, but they're involved in a system that makes it very difficult to do that. It just seems to me, and by the way, one of the things that's I've been toying with for a couple decades now is how it seems that the power in Washington continues to go back and forth between both parties. Right. For the most part, there's some exceptions, but what that tells me is most Americans really don't want the extremes.
Yes.
So the one party is gone extreme, and so we say, we can't have that. We're going to put the other party in power, and they go the extreme in the other direction, and so we keep switching back and forth.
Right.
And sometimes it kind of feels like, as a voter, I want to say to myself, to me, okay, Bevere, when are you going to get the hint? that both sides, the extremes on both sides, are going to be a problem. Now, I know people watching this who are either one or the other extremes will probably reject that idea, but I do think that I think the voter is still, for the most part, the average voter is a moderate voter. Maybe center right, maybe center left, but they're moderate. Is that fair?
That's my perception as to what's there. And I think that just piggybacking on some of what you're saying in terms of my views on some of this, the objective in a democracy is the idea that you are trying to make everybody, no matter what their perspective is involved in the public sphere of decision making. And many times their preferred option is not what's going to be materialized, because there are a majority of people who don't agree with that particular option. But in a functioning democracy, even the person who's in the minority still feels that they live to fight another day in order to be able to promote that view and to persuade people to come their direction. And so then the objective becomes capturing the people that are sort of solidly to your view, if you view them on a continuum, solidly on your side of the continuum of the view, plus enough of those people that get you over towards the middle part of the continuum to develop a majority of people that then back that. And that's where you go there. And so the new minority now still lives to fight another day to try to persuade people back. It's not ideal. It doesn't lead to the best solutions necessarily, but it leads to solutions that are cohesive to society continuing to function and move forward. The challenge that we've got, in my estimation, and it's been building for 30 years or more, is that the new political strategy is, rather than saying, here's where my group is, what can I do to capture that middle section in order to build a strong coalition where there's a strong support of something. And the response now is whip up my base as hard as I can to get them out to vote and demoralize anybody who doesn't agree with us, so that my people will get out and vote and we'll win and get our full 100% agenda approved over and against the rest of society. And then that then means that you have to then work to keep down the minority in society. If you get your agenda passed, then you have to work to keep them down constantly, because they become this big threat to the great thing you've created. And both sides, in my estimation, have continually moved to that. I think on the right, we're seeing a real disturbing, it's drifted from just being partisan to moving to authoritarian. And I think
exactly right. And God forbid you as a congressperson or a senator dare think about negotiating with the other side,
right,
and compromising anything. And from my perspective, which is much less economic and more biblical,
right,
which doesn't mean I understand either, but nevertheless, I come to it more from a biblical perspective, is that's when politics almost becomes a religion.
Yeah.
When it's about winning the argument and knocking down everybody else's perceived idols,
right,
so that we can ensconce our creed. And if you compromise that, you're guilty of heresy.
Yeah, right.
And so look at, we can look at the Republic. I mean, Liz Cheney, who no one ever would question her conservative credentials.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, seriously. And yet she's on the outs. But then look at Joe Manchin, who is a moderate Democrat, who has been sort of a fly in the ointment of progressives who see a very narrow window of getting their agenda through, and Joe Manchin's standing in the way. And he's been told, if you want to be a Republican, become a Republican, right? Right.
Yeah.
So there's just no room, or little room, for influence by this. I want to be careful of the terminology. I was going to say sensible politicians, but it's kind of hard to do all of this stuff. And here's the thing. We're talking about a citizenry who has needs, who can be helped by folks working together and getting things done.
Right. Yeah. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. I think for me, one of the discouraging things in the midst of all this, and we're getting into politics now.
That's all right. We do not avoid subjects here on Face You Can Understand It. We go all in, so feel free.
Right. And I just think the thing that has been possibly some of the most disheartening stuff I've seen in my lifetime has been in these past 5 or 6 years, is to see the way the church has responded. And I don't just mean evangelicals and support for Trump, but just the spiritual formation of the everyday Christian and how they have interacted with these issues. And it's just been very discouraging to me. And
I know we've gone at evangelicals of late, white evangelicals, because they've been prominent, and so I understand that. But I am quick to point out, as a mainline Methodist, that the reality is we mainline Methodists wrote the book on politics and activism back in the 20s and the 30s, and all the evangelicals did was, when the moral majority came up in the 80s, they just took our playbook. And ran with it. So ultimately, there's no innocent parties here. But what bothers me about this, and I agree with you, I've been very disturbed in the last 5 or 6 years. But what bothers me is that when the church breaks along the divisions that are simply the secular political divisions, tells me that the church in America is more enculturated with American culture and convictions than it is with the gospel.
Right.
And I do think we need to raise some serious questions, difficult questions. And I say this, I don't care what your politics are, left, right, Democrat, Republican, mainliner, or evangelical. We need to ask, the question is my Christianity more American or Christian?
Right.
Because I do think that's a problem. And
Yeah.
by the way, I am not dissing everything about American culture and
Right.
everything about American ideals. I'm not at all.
Right.
Some of those ideals I think are good ideas. I'm just simply saying that, I think for many people, the America has become the de facto church
Yeah.
for a lot of Christians.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on. And it is very disturbing. And as long as we're like that, we can't offer an alternative to the world.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
It becomes a real problem. Yeah.
Right.
So that's where we are. Well, yeah. So that's my view for the day.
Okay.
There was one other issue that I wanted to mention, and all of a sudden it went out of my mind, because that's what happens when you get to a certain age, right, Michael?
Absolutely.
I guess. Okay. Well, here's it does sort of get to what we were talking about. You and I, in our last conversation a month ago, of course, came across with, I think both of us were in agreement that we need to be careful about applying the Bible to today's economic context, because it was a very
Right.
different context.
Right.
But if I'm a Christian in a community, and let's just say I do have that sense of entrepreneurship, or that sense of, I want to start a business in my town,
Right.
as a Christian, how does the Bible guide me?
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not meaning, how you start the business,
right.
but what should guide me as a person, as a Christian who is in business in a community?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. There's so many wonderful layers that are there. One of the things I was coming across recently was thinking about, again, I've visited this many times, Leviticus and the Jubilee, the institution of the Jubilee. And so that usually gets discussed in terms of debt forgiveness and redistribution of wealth. And see, God was a socialist. He wanted everything, divided amongst all the people, that type of thing. But what you will notice, if you think about that a little bit more from a different perspective, is that, yes, everything was distributed, but there was no central entity set up to manage how the nation would operate. The private property was not owned by the state of Israel. Each individual went back to their own family land, and that was the family's land. It belonged to them. But another interesting piece of that I've reflected on is that in the context of that culture, where land and labor were the two productive things that existed in the economy, capital really, in any modern sense of the world, didn't exist. So it was land and labor. So what are the two things that get redistributed? One, all indentured servitude ends. So the person regains the product of their labor to be able to invest that, and the land returns back to the person. So every 50 years, you get everybody established back on their property. Why? Because it seems the implication, without clearly explicitly being stated, is that God wants each person to be participating in this great exercise of providing for themselves and providing for others. That's a mutually shared activity that's for all of society. And so I think one of the things as an employer is that if you are going to start a business, you want it to be something that's going to provide a good that is helpful for the people who are purchasing your product, but you're also investing in the people that you're hiring as well too, that they can be fully included as in the Jubilee, as productive members of their community, and that you're investing in them being able to become better and more productive people. And I think when you do those two things, that feeds over into all the relationships that you have with the community and with customers, and how that develops over time. And it's going to shape how you do your employment policies and the type of benefits that you want to provide for your people that are working for you. So I know of a guy who's I think he owns 7 or 8 Subway franchises. And one of the things he talked about there, he talks about how, this is before the pandemic was going on, but I remember talking with him at that point, was just talking about, fast food places pay a little above minimum wage often in places. They pay much better now because of the labor shortage. But he talked about, he had a whole bonus system set up for if you accomplished this level of activity and performance, then you get these kind of bonuses. He had set asides for being able to save money for college education. You could work your way up into an assistant manager with, the full health care and all of these other benefits that went along with it. So he had designed his whole system with the idea of trying to take people who may have very minimal skills and trying to think in terms of designing a path for them to be able to continue to flourish and become better and more skilled. And even if they didn't stay with him, to have skills that they could take elsewhere.
Oh.
So I think those are some of the things that I think about when an entrepreneur talks about when I want to start a business. And here, I'll tell you this point too. Let me bring this conversation.
Keep going.
Yeah, it was an interesting question because you talk about your pastor. And so I'm sure you occasionally have people come to you to talk to you. Some of them may ask you about, business decisions that they're needing to make. So I remember one pastor friend I was talking to, I won't mention his name here because I don't want to betray a confidence, but pastor of a fairly large Presbyterian church. He said, so I had this guy come to me, and I've been reading up on economics and talking about business people often feel like they're beaten down by their pastors, that, they're always being criticized and capitalism is terrible and all that kind of stuff. He said, so I didn't want to, he said, I began thinking about that. I need to be less critical and to listen to what my parishioner was saying and not being so quick to offer judgment. And so he said, this layman came up to him and he says, I'm thinking about buying this whole set of franchises of Rent-A-Center complexes, which is known for kind of a step up true above the payday lending,
Sure.
kind of thing. It's pretty exploitive stuff, that kind of thing. And so the pastor was saying, well, he didn't want to be critical of the guy. So he just kind of listened to him, talking a little bit. So this guy went on about his business. He got 2 or 3 of these franchises. They'd gone on for a while. And months later, the guy came back and snuck into his pastor. And he says, as I've been into this, he says, I'm beginning to wonder about the moral implications of how my business is working and how these franchises work. And he says, his pastor finally said, well, when you told me you were thinking about buying those, I was kind of wondering the same thing my direction. And the guy says, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you ask me?
Yeah.
And so I think a part of what we need in churches with business people and with pastors and so on is some space for some courageous conversations that are difficult to have, that are fraught with the potential for misunderstanding and frustration, but have them nonetheless.
Part of the problem with the church is this has been the space where we don't have those conversations because we don't want to offend anybody or upset anybody. But I've said to a few of my friends who say that they believe the whole Bible and think pastors should preach on the whole Bible. Like I say to them in response, do you really mean that? Yeah. Because the Bible talks about immigrants, and the Bible talks about the poor, and the Bible talks about all this kind of stuff. Do you really, really want that? Now, by the way, as a pastor, when I go to our conferences, annual conference, and we get some guest preachers, I cringe too when some of them rail against capitalism, because the Bible tells us we need to take care of the poor, but that doesn't tell us how to take care of the poor in the 21st century. That's more complicated. So the Christian principle is, yes, we need to take care of the poor. Now, how does that look like in 2021?
Exactly. And that goes back to a guy I was reading, ethicist year ago, was talking about sort of there's a ladder of abstraction, I think is what he talked about. The idea, you go back into the Old Testament, it talks about love your neighbor, come down that ladder a little bit. The idea there should be no poor among you. Get down to the bottom of that ladder is let the poor glean the edge of the field in order to take care of them. Okay, well, let's take that and pick that ladder up and drop it down in the 21st century. Well, the top part still sounds good. The middle part, there shouldn't be any poor among you, but poor gleaning the field makes absolutely no sense. So the question is, how do we ascend to that part of the ladder that still makes sense and then extend the ladder back down to where we are? And that to me this is my bully pulpit again. This is where I think the conversation between theologians and business people and economists has broken down. And that the business people and economists would do well to listen to the theology that is there from theologians, and theologians need to understand economics better. to have that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's real interesting. About 12 years or 13 years ago, I was invited to go to Oxford University over in England to participate in an international conference on business and government and ethics.
Right.
And several of us who were there were from the religious community. And it was really interesting because there was a guy there. He was an American.
Okay.
Who I think he was a pastor one time, but he actually became a consultant on business ethics for businesses. And the one thing he said to me was how many people in business were surprised when they heard what he did, because they would say to him, "What does ethics have to do with business?"
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I think that indicates you're probably right. The conversations have broken down and we need to get better at that and be willing to have the conversations.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
I just appreciate it. And next month, we will be talking about economics and COVID. What are the economic challenges that are complex, and what economic implications do some of our policies have that are also complex, and how do we navigate through that in this time, which I think is probably going to be here for a little while. I hate to say it,
Yeah.
but I think that it is.
So are you thinking maybe this one that we're going to do on COVID could go viral? Is that your?
Yes, maybe it will.
Yeah.
Maybe it will go viral. It will be the podcast that will send Calmly Considered viral. So, anyway,
with COVID.
All right, friends. Michael, on that note, I'm going to sign off, and just a reminder that Faith Seeking Understanding, the title comes from our patron saint, Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand." So have a good day, friends, and keep seeking.
Bye.
See you soon.